Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it. At risk of making you uncomfortable, and you don't have to answer any question that I ask you, obviously. You are your own autonomous individual, and if you don't want to answer the following question, please don't. You seem to infer that you may not want to answer the following question, but I wouldn't be the magic skeptic if I didn't drill down on this particular point. But
take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way. Thank you.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month, and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts. Up for today is part 1 of my debate with Dry Apologist, a Christian apologist who runs the Twitter page and YouTube channel of the same name. In this conversation, we discussed the Catholic Church, faith versus gullibility, morality, ethics, and a whole host of other topics. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it, but just remember, this is only part 1. So if you enjoy this conversation, make sure you check out part 2 next week, where we get into one of the arguments for God's existence. Or if indeed you're watching this in the future, you can go ahead and watch both parts right away. Whatever the case may be, I hope you enjoy this conversation. And for now, I give you Dry Apologist. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all most welcome to another episode of A Magician's Thoughts, and it's a very special episode indeed. I'm joined here today by Caleb, otherwise known as the Dry Apologist. He runs a Twitter page and a YouTube channel, and Caleb is a theist. Is that fair to say, Caleb?
Yeah, I'm a Catholic, Roman Catholic theist. Yep.
Cool. And so, Caleb, we were just talking about this before we hit record here, but we haven't set, and I did kind of purposefully, so we haven't set any kind of an agenda about what we're going to talk about here today. You're a theist. Depending on your definition of the term, I'm an atheist. Some might say I'm an agnostic, rather. Either way, I don't share your belief in a God, and I was hoping to talk about that today and figure out why indeed you believe, and I'm hoping we'll have an interesting back and forth. But before we get that far, Caleb, I'd actually just love to know, how did you become religious? Were you born into a religious family? Did you adopt religiosity later on in life? Because truthfully, my friend, I'm not familiar with your biographical details or your autobiographical details. I followed you for quite some time on Twitter, and I've just recently discovered your YouTube channel, and you do some great stuff. By the way, to my listeners, the links to those will be in the description below, and you should definitely check those out if you're interested in getting the other perspective separate from my own. But I digress. Caleb, just start by introducing yourself, if you wouldn't mind, and if you could get into some of those autobiographical details. I'd love to know how you became a self-described Roman Catholic.
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, and then of course growing up I just embraced that as, the faith I inherited, and I believed it, but I didn't look into trying to debate people about it or justify it so much. And then when I got to college, I got interested in what atheists had to say in particular, and wanted to get more into philosophy, apologetics, theology, and so on, because I wanted to see if my beliefs actually were reasonable. And the more and more I've engaged, I definitely think a reasonable case can be made for other perspectives. Atheism, I do think, is a defensible perspective. I don't, of course, hold to it, and that's both I do think, a strong case can be made for at least a reasonable version of Christianity. There are some versions that I don't think are very reasonable, but, I do recognize, excuse me, there's a personal element as well, and that's going to factor in, at least into my thinking. So, yeah, I do have biases and such, but I'm open, if somebody can, at least I like to think in principle I could change my mind, but I recognize it's going to be hard. So, but yeah, my channel though, I do try to have on a lot of, really anybody who wants to come on, but especially atheists who are into philosophy, and I, try to let them, give their side. I do want to get, people on who, want to give a strong case, so the audience can assess for their own. And I'm going to have a Emerson Green is a fairly active atheist on YouTube and Twitter. He's going to be on my channel next week, so I'm looking forward to that. So yeah, I'm really just looking forward to having conversations like with people like yourself, so we can get really the best of both sides out there, and it's not just some of these talking points that are, misrepresent each other.
I love hearing you say that bit at the end there, because that's a goal we share. Actually, that's the reason I've invited you on here. So just for the sake of the listeners, in terms of how we got here, I've already mentioned that I followed you on Twitter for quite a while, and you and I have actually had a number of back and forths on Twitter. We had one just recently about creatio ex nihilo and consciousness, which we might get into at some point in this conversation. We may or we may not. It's not necessarily pertinent, but just so the listeners are aware, we do have some history together. But in terms of what I was just saying about the shared goal, your goal, as you just said, Caleb, is to have conversations with the best that the community has to offer. And you inferred there that you certainly don't want to straw man the other side. I'm assuming what you're driving at there is that you'd rather deal with steelmans of the opposition, which is to say the most robust, strongest version of the arguments that disagree with your own position. And that's precisely why I've brought you on here today. I just got off the phone with a loved one of mine a moment ago, and truth be told, I said that I was actually apparently very excited to have this conversation, but also nervous, because it's apparent when I looked at your content, and when I look, and as I have been doing for quite some time, been looking through your Twitter threads and so on, your stuff. It's clear that you've done the requisite reading and the research to defend your position. And so that's the very reason I brought you on here, Caleb, because I think you're actually a rather good example of an honest and well-read religious apologist. And so I want to have that conversation. I want a true test of my philosophical convictions. And yeah, that's why we're here. So we share that goal, my friend, and it's an honor to have you here doing that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, a lot of times I think some of us, especially on the theist side, seems like we're kind of yelling into the void, and there aren't too many other Christians who want to back us up. Sometimes it's a lot of, I don't know, there's just a lot of tribalism that goes on, and it's just,
sure.
It gets really frustrating. I'm sure you experienced that. So.
Sure, and you know what? I have to hold my hand up, Caleb. I mean, I've taken part in the tribalism to some extent. A cursory glance at my channel will reveal that one of my series of videos is called The Most Annoying Religious People. That said, I would argue that series of videos has been very, very carefully curated. I feature people who, in my estimation, are actually being either way over the top in terms of the claims they're making, or even perhaps dishonest. So I don't want to make too many assumptions about who you hold in high esteem, but there will be an episode coming out soon that features none other than Frank Turek, who I'm sure you're familiar with. And I'm not convinced that Frank Turek is the most honest representative of the theistic community. I don't want to derail the conversation in terms of discussing who your favorite apologists are versus who I think is honest or dishonest. But I just wanted to say, I wanted to hold my hand up so that I don't get accused of being disingenuous here. I've definitely added fuel to the fire of the tribalism to one extent or another, but I would never feature an apologist like you in my Most Annoying Religious People segment, because, as I said already, and not to give you a big ego or a big head or something like that, but I view you as an honest operator, and I think that makes all the difference. I don't see you as being kind of a sophist. So yeah, does that make sense? Or have I just shot myself in the foot there?
No, I totally get what you're saying. And yeah, I won't, list names, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely people, and it tends to be people that are more, they made a career out of it. It's not to say anybody who's making a career is thereby dishonest, but I think there is a pressure to sell a product, and I think it can happen on both sides, and it's always a difficulty. Like, it'd be nice to be able to do apologetics as a career, but then there's that danger that it's going to lead to, you're selling to an audience. And I'm not saying if somebody does it full time, that means they're dishonest, but that is at least a stigma or worry that a lot of people have. So.
Yes, and especially if you've written books. If you've written books and dedicated your life to a particular thesis or the defense of a particular idea. I mean, I'm just in terms, forgive me for the rudimentary psychology here, but let's just psychologize it for a moment. It must be difficult to climb down off that horse, if you will, right? If you've dedicated your life to defending a particular position and then people actually reveal your position to be flawed or fallacious, it's got to be difficult to climb down off that horse if you're a pretty notable academic, shall we say. And so, I mean, I can extend an olive branch there, and I sympathize with people in that position. But I guess one shouldn't get into this game if they're not interested truly in changing their mind, because I've changed my mind on an immense number of topics, some of the bigger topics. I used to be a Sam Harris-esque morality is objective person. Now I've come to the conclusion that that's not true. I'm actually an anti-realist. Now, morally speaking, that's one of the biggest shifts in my philosophy in recent years. But then obviously, most notable, I suppose, and why I'm making this video and why I've met all the others. I used to be a Catholic like you, Caleb. And so I went from being religious to being an atheist. And so, yeah, if you're not prepared to change your mind, perhaps this is the wrong game to be in. Would you agree with that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's hard once you've built a career that becomes, I think, part of your identity. I mean, if I make a YouTube video, it's like I have some emotional attachment to the ideas in that video. Sometimes I'll take a video down because I no longer agree with the argumentation. I don't want it out there. And that's just my approach. But I know I'm not saying everybody has to do that. But
no, I think that's actually very honest. It's something that I've begun to think about. That said, I've got a lot of videos on my channel. I've got over 110 videos or something at this point. So if I were to go back and start looking through the back catalog, I would presumably find claims and tenets that I have either more nuanced views on now, or perhaps even had a complete seismic shift in my perspective on that. But that is going to be quite an undertaking. But I think you're right, Caleb. I think you're doing it the right way. And again, for the reason why I brought you on here. Segueing slightly then, Caleb, let's just dive right into the meat of this conversation. You said that you were raised Catholic. Let me just throw out a question that you probably answered 100 times before, and something that definitely gives me pause for thought as an atheist. But what is your response to the claim, which I think is fairly irrefutable, for in most cases at least, that religiosity is actually just an incidental fact of one's birth, right? So if you're born in India, chances are you're going to be a Hindu. You know this line, right? And so you happen to be born in the United States, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not surprising, right? So United States, now, to what extent it's Catholic, I'm not familiar with the demographics, but it's obviously majority Christian. How do you deal with that charge? How do you defend against the claim that your religiosity, the ideals that you hold sincerely, the beliefs that you hold sincerely, Caleb, how do you deal with the allegation that those beliefs are merely a byproduct of your socio-cultural and geographical location?
Yeah, and I've thought about, well, it's kind of a side tangent, but I've thought about posting something about this problem, but my general thoughts are that for a lot of people, and probably for myself for a time period, a child isn't going to be able to assess the claims they're taught and such, so you're going to accept it. and that is going to be a byproduct of culture and upbringing. But it doesn't mean that one can't then go and assess the evidence, and it could be, or reasons or whatever, and it could be that a majority of people on Earth hold to the beliefs they were taught and never examine them, and they're not even, maybe not rationally justified, or maybe they are, but not as justified as would be ideal. I don't know, but it wouldn't undermine if a few people have, and I think I've sufficiently looked into it since being taught as a child. So I think I don't attribute much to my upbringing. I considered leaving the faith and revealed that to others. So I don't think it's relevant for me, and I think I could justify why I believe what I do. But it could be that a lot of people, that it is very cultural, and I don't doubt that that is the case. But yeah, I would just say it's kind of a case by case. Otherwise, it can fall into the genetic fallacy, where it's just because somebody derived a belief from somewhere that maybe isn't a good way to derive it, it doesn't make that belief false. So you have to then look at, well, what are your reasons? And some people may not have good reasons, or they might. So that's how I look at it. I mean, because in Europe, it's becoming increasingly secular. So I'm sure there are people that are raised to be atheists, and I wouldn't say, well, their atheism is thereby false or unjustified, even though it does probably has some cultural influence. It's just, I think everybody just has a obligation to test their beliefs as much as they can. In some countries they can't really. So
that's a very interesting response, Caleb. Actually, it had occurred to me at the very minute you started speaking that, but hang on a minute, I live in Europe, geographically speaking, and Europe is actually quite a hotbed of atheism, if you will. And so does the same criticism apply? But I think it's a double barrel thing, right? It's not. So I'm from Europe, right? But I'm also from Ireland originally, and Ireland is a very, very Catholic country, or at least it was still largely very Catholic when I was growing up in the 90s. Since then, there has been a sea change in Ireland, which we don't need to get into, but numerous referenda in a row have demonstrated that the average citizen in Ireland, the majority of them, have moved away from, at the very least, a Catholic ethic. But also census data reveals that the number of people who check the atheist/agnostic box is increasing all the time, and so on. But I was definitely born and raised a Catholic, and then I transitioned out of Catholicism to atheism. And so I'm not so sure if it applies to me in that regard. But that acknowledged, the one thought did occur, Caleb, as you were giving your response. Presumably you think Islam is false, right? Otherwise, you'd be a Muslim. Would that be a fair statement? Presumably, you think Hinduism is false. Would that be fair to attribute those statements to you?
Right, or at least, yeah. I think they're false, but at the very least, I should be committed to that. I'm not sufficiently convinced that they're true. I wouldn't necessarily have to have 100% credence, but yeah, I'm pretty confident that they're false. Yeah.
Sure, I'm not on board the 100% train. I hate when people get into arguments about certainty. I run up against that all the time as an atheist. Oh, but do you know that there isn't a God 100%? And then you say, well, of course I don't know that. And then they say, see, no, gotcha. So therefore there might be a God then. Well, getting an epistemologically honest person to admit that there might be something is a bit of a joke, and to say that that's a notch on the belt of your belief system, I think is a bit of a nonsense. So I would agree with you there about the certainty point, Caleb. But when you say that you've looked into your beliefs, despite the fact that your beliefs are in line with your geographical location, when you say you've looked into them though, and you've decided, but I think that they withstand introspection. There's obviously going to be Muslims in the Middle East who are going to say that about their faith. There's going to be Hindus in India who say that about their faith. And I just have to be honest with you, but that's the kind of sense I'm getting when you respond that way. I just hear it as, well, of course the beliefs that I was born into are true. I've looked into them, and I was just lucky enough to be born into the correct religion and in the correct place. So I still feel to some extent or another that criticism holds. But you said something else, which I think is going to be the fruit of this conversation. and that is that you looked into it and you decided that your beliefs actually weren't wanting, that they were actually robust and that they were rational and above all else true. And so perhaps that's the way we need to go with this conversation. I want to know what that introspection was and why you decided that they were true despite the geographical criticism. But if you want to come back on that reasserting of the geographical criticism that I've just articulated, please do. But after you've responded to that, Caleb, please proceed into the introspection that you referred to that led you to the conclusion that Catholicism is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the geographical consideration is a concern. Like, somebody should examine, okay, why do I hold these beliefs? Is it largely because of how I was raised, or purely because I was raised, or, have I actually tested these beliefs? Because, like, for example, I'm opposed to slavery, but I live in a society that's very opposed to slavery, but I think we're right on that, right? But there could be other beliefs, that I hold that maybe I haven't really looked into, and maybe I do just hold them because I haven't scrutinized them enough. So yeah, I think it's a worthy concern, but yeah, I don't think somebody should stop at that, because yeah, it can cut both ways, as you said. But in terms of like the reasons, that's what I really like to focus on. And
sure.
And yeah, I agree with you. Like, yeah, I don't think an atheist has to have certainty of 100% to be an atheist, or a theist has to have 100. Yeah, I mean, 100% really isn't attainable for most things. And I think rather one should say, look, this is the body of considerations points in this direction, and that's kind of where you're at. And I think that's good enough for that person to be justified. And maybe they can't convince somebody else. Like, I may not be able to convince you, or you may not be able to convince me, but that doesn't mean that I or you can't be justified, because it is somewhat subjective. I think, we've experienced different things, and our minds might work a little differently. And, and in my theology, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I think God will judge people according to that. I don't think, atheists are, necessarily condemned. I do invite them to convert, but I'll be upfront about that. But I don't think like, oh, somebody's an atheist, they're going to hell, or somebody's a Catholic or a Christian, they're definitely going to heaven. I mean, we don't know. It's my view. We just have to, follow truth and charity where it leads. And that's the general Catholic theological position, just because people always bring that up. So I always like to make that clear. I don't presume to judge where people are going in the afterlife.
Just to clarify there, you said that you think God will judge people according to what they honestly kind of were exposed to, what they knew or didn't know. Is that what you're saying? Are you, to one extent or another, there addressing the problem of what William Lane Craig might call the unevangelized? So if somebody didn't know of God's existence, are you saying that your view is that God wouldn't judge or punish that person for merely not being exposed to the correct theology? Is that what you're saying? Right.
Or say somebody has some cognitive reason that really, honestly pushes them towards atheism, and I don't think God will know that they have that, like, so he's going to see what somebody's justification is. It's not just a simple check in a box. So you were in the right church, you did this. It's more about somebody's searching for truth and seeking to be a charitable person. And hopefully, all things go right. Hopefully that person will become a Christian, and in my view, hopefully enter the Catholic Church. But, we live in a messy, fallen world according to, Christian theology. So, I don't think everything is finished in this life. I think God judges people where they're at, and then there's more work to be done in the afterlife, purgatory and so on, for people to heal and grow. And I think that can include, I hope that it includes everybody's, but I can't say I know. I just don't know.
So we're already in very deep waters. You've said several things there that give me pause for thought. So one of the things I've written down here, you probably saw me furiously scribbling while you were talking just then, but you said, I think God will judge, and then you moved on to say how God will judge.
Yeah.
I instantly hear that, and forgive me at various points in this conversation if I say something that sounds very direct. I'm very kind of, as any frequent viewer of my channel will tell you, I'm very plain. I just say what I'm thinking. So please understand that if anything comes across as short or in that way. That I'm not intending to be offensive or to be rude, but when you say things like that, what I'm hearing is that Caleb is telling me that he knows the mind of God. Right? Caleb is telling me that he knows how God judges people, and I hear that, and I'm not I'm not entirely above the memes of the magic sky god and stuff like that in terms of humor and things like that. I don't think they're genuine philosophical comment. Fine, but the meme occurs in my mind. I'm like, this guy is telling me that he knows the mind of the magic sky god. He's telling me that he knows how that God is going to judge, and that he knows the will of that God, and that God is going to let people off the hook if they weren't exposed to the correct theology. And then, meanwhile, I'm sat here thinking about this in a more of a secular manner. I'm thinking about this without your supernatural presuppositions or beliefs, or however you might classify them. Maybe you wouldn't call them presuppositions. Maybe you'd call them justified true belief, whatever way you'd refer to your beliefs. I'm sat here without having any of those beliefs in my mind, and I'm thinking about the Bible, the text that represents these beliefs, especially for a Catholic, or you might go further and say the Catholic Catechism. But even that, right? It's not clear to me that the Catholic Church's view on the unevangelized, albeit maybe Pope Francis has brought the Catholic Church in a slightly more progressive direction, but it's not clear to me that the Bible has a very forgiving bent to it when it comes to, say, non-believers. Like the doubting Thomas. I mean, the moral of that story is that doubt is, to one extent or another, inappropriate. And Thomas is essentially castigated for daring to doubt. And it's kind of considered a bit insensitive that he didn't just believe without the evidence. Whereas in my view, Thomas is the hero of that story who didn't believe until the evidence was shown to him, right? And then there's, the fool, as it's referred to in the Bible, who doesn't believe in God. I don't see the biblical text. I don't see the discourse in that document as being representative of a very egalitarian and sympathetic view towards people such as myself. And I don't even need to go to the historical examples of how the church has treated non-believers and how those were justified scripturally. I'm sure you're very familiar with all of that yourself. And yeah, so there's a lot there. I've given you a lot now to unpack, Caleb, so I'm going to shut up and give you a chance to respond. But I just wanted to give you a sense of where my mind goes to when you start telling me about how God is actually, understanding, and that he wouldn't judge people if they weren't exposed to the theology and so on and so forth. So how would you respond to some of those things? They would be concerns that an atheist such as myself would have.
Yeah. So there's a lot there. So I will say that the way that and this isn't how all Christians are going to operate, but the way that I kind of work is I'm taking considerations from like God in the philosophical sense of considering like what a perfect being would reasonably do, and that can be independent of Christianity. So if some like an atheist or non-Christian or whoever is going to bring up something and say like, well, I don't think a loving God would do this, probably I would agree with them, and I'm going to then say, okay, now we got to look at Christian theology and see if it lines up with what a loving God, and maybe that requires me to, reinterpret some biblical passages. Maybe they aren't literal or, totally historical and so on. So that's just to give people kind of a heads up where I'm coming from. But I do try to reconcile Christian theology, but I am kind of, trying to reconcile a lot of things. I'm not just gonna like look at the Bible and go, oh, it says it right there. I'm gonna scrutinize it. And I have a rather flexible view of biblical inspiration and inerrancy and how that works. I'm not, like a really hard inerrantist about the Bible. It doesn't really interest me that much. But yeah, the issue of the unevangelized, yeah. So like the Catholic Church's position, at least since Vatican II in the 60s, has been pretty on board with the idea that even an atheist could be saved. Again, the church isn't going to say, oh, look, give a list of who's saved and who's not, unless somebody's canonized a saint. Church, we just don't know. But yeah, the church has been pretty progressive, you could say, in regards to that issue, since, at least since Vatican II. But in terms of the biblical passages, so I'm not an expert on this topic. I do have some ideas, but like somebody like Randall Rouser has written a decent amount about it that I'd recommend people look at it. He has this book, Is the Atheist My Neighbor, which I haven't read, but apparently it dives into this. But in terms of those verses that you brought up, just kind of my quick stab at them. the fool says in his heart there is no God in the Old Testament. I think a general interpretation is that may not even be referring to an atheist per se. Like if you look at the whole context, it's more about the person who's saying like God's not going to judge them or not. But even if you say no, it's calling atheists fools, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not going to be saved. It just means they're drawing a foolish position. Now, I'm not saying the author of that psalm wouldn't have taken a negative view of atheists. He probably would have. But the idea, though, like what's the message behind that psalm? I don't know that it's like saying an atheist would be condemned. And the Old Testament really isn't as big on even evangelizing as much as like until you, at least that's a general interpretation, at least until you get to like Christianity, the New Testament and such. But yeah, the New Testament gets a little trickier because you have like the verse in Romans that seems to say like we can know God through all things that He's made, we can know His nature, and it seems to take a condemning view. But there are people who interpret that verse differently as well, like saying maybe it's saying somebody who draws the wrong conclusion about God, like they choose to worship an idol even though they see that the idol would not be the true God, something like that. There are some atheists I've talked to on Twitter that have suggested that type of reading, and so there are some different ways to interpret it in that passage in Romans, but there's a lot more that can be said. And then the doubting Thomas passage, so that kind of different. The way I've always interpreted it is that Jesus is praising the other disciples that they were able to have faith without needing the evidence, so that is praiseworthy because he already, had built a relation with them and, had taught them, and like that would have been enough. But the fact that Thomas needed to see more, like Jesus, conceded to that, but it is kind of a lacking in faith. So faith is still praiseworthy, but it doesn't necessarily mean somebody who doesn't have as much faith is thereby going to be condemned to hell. So like I think faith can be a virtue, but it doesn't mean somebody's evil if they lack some faith for, because they just thought that they've. So I guess the guiding principle for me is like, what is somebody actively trying to not seek a relation with God? I would view that as not good. But if somebody's saying they're trying to follow truth and they just really don't believe God exists, then, again, I think that then God's going to know that that's how they're, that they're still a truthful person. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. But yeah, there's a lot more that can be said.
It makes sense. I find it to be morally questionable. That's all. So you said there that faith is a virtue, which in my view, it's the opposite. Assuming that the interpretation here, in my interpretation rather, that faith is being defined as belief in the absence of evidence, which I think is the obvious definition that is in operation in the story of the doubting Thomas. So you said it yourself. The others believed because they were faithful, right? Thomas needed more. He needed to see it. He needed more evidence, right? And you say that the moral of the story is faith is a virtue. I agree that that is the moral of the story. I just don't agree that faith is a virtue. The message of the story that it is better to believe in the absence of evidence. And that to me is a rather dangerous, I dare say, a rather dangerous idea. And I would submit to you, Caleb, that you wouldn't practice that virtue in any other domain of your life. If you went to the doctor and that you were sick and the doctor said, I'm going to give you this medicine, it's untested, but, it's virtuous for you to have faith in it, you would, now look, there's a million reasons why that analogy isn't absolutely apt. No analogy is perfect. Otherwise it wouldn't be an analogy. We'd just be talking about the actual event. But it just seems to me bizarre, not even bizarre. It actually makes perfect sense to me. I think the reason faith exists as a concept in the way that I've defined it is because very often the evidence is lacking and faith is all one does in fact have. And Thomas wanted more. And the moral of the story is that he shouldn't have wanted more, that he should have believed in the absence of evidence. And that, as you put it yourself, would have been more virtuous of him. I would not agree at all with the premise that would in fact make him virtuous. That would make him gullible. And gullibility is dangerous. When I'm being given a medicine or when I'm doing anything in life, if I'm going to buy a new car, for goodness sake, I want the car to be investigated. I'm not going to use the so-called virtue of faith and trust that the car is going to function. I'm going to want to know that the engine is in good condition and that the wheels of the car aren't going to fall off when I'm going down the motorway or what you guys might call the highway, right? Do you see how, to an atheist, to an outsider such as myself, an ex-outsider, if you will, that this virtue of faith, which I just view as gullibility, is at best dangerous, but at worst, well, I would say at best ignorant, but at worst dangerous? Does any of that land for you, or do I just sound completely irrational with those concerns, Caleb? And can you address those concerns in a way that might actually salvage the concept of faith? Do you think I just got the definition wrong? Have I misread the narrative? Or, you know, what are your thoughts on that, my friend?
So there are different definitions of faith, and like some will throw around definitions I would say, you know, are obviously false. Like there's like the joke that gets attributed to Mark Twain, like faith is believing what you know ain't so. And it's like, well, that's obviously not a definition a religious person's going to agree to. But I guess the definition to me would be a faith is, so I think in Hebrews, I think it says faith is believing something like what you can't see, something like that. Yeah. And I would say, so I look at faith as a trust in something that you have some justification for, but maybe not empirical justification. So like, and that might be a point of disagreement, but like Thomas, he didn't have the empirical evidence in seeing Jesus risen, but he did, I still think, have other reasons based on the other apostles' testimony, based on his own cultivated relation with Jesus and so on, that he still had reason to believe. He just didn't have it with his senses. And I don't think that we always need to have a sensory confirmation. Sometimes we do, but sometimes it can be reasonable to trust somebody because they've seen it, or if it's something more like metaphysical, like a basic claim, you know, like I could question my senses altogether and think, you know, I'm in the Matrix or something, but I don't think that seems reasonable, so I'm going to still, you know, have a kind of faith that my senses are reliable. And it might be unreasonable then to say like, no, I actually need to, like, somebody needs to show me I'm not in the Matrix. That would be like asking for a little too much. Now, in Thomas's case, I definitely think it's plausible why he would want to see Jesus and feel his wounds, but I think perhaps the narrative of the story is suggesting that Thomas already had enough. And now that's not to say that anybody who's an atheist or whoever is in that position. You know, most people did not walk with Jesus and so on. So, yeah, I definitely think the message of the story is promoting faith. But at the same time, I think there could be some nuance taken. And of course, you know, in looking in the Gospels, I mean, I do take them as historical narratives of Jesus's life, but I don't think they're like newspaper accounts. So, like, did that episode happen just like that or something? I don't know. You know, and John's gospel is generally considered maybe less historical than like Mark's gospel. So that's another thing to take into account. And that's not to say like I don't believe that story, but I do kind of look at it could be not a purely historical narrative about Jesus. And I just throw that out as a possibility, not like something I'm promoting. So there's just lots of things. And that's why I try to just keep my mind open about different avenues one might take, because, yeah, I mean, there are lots of questions somebody can raise. So.
Yeah, you said something there that reveals, I think, a very bright line in terms of the difference between your epistemology and my epistemology. So epistemology, just for the sake of the listeners, perhaps you guys know exactly what I'm talking about, but just to make sure that everybody is on the same page, epistemology is, tell me if you'd agree with this definition, Caleb, I want to make sure that I get it right because you're well read in terms of philosophy as well. I would say epistemology is how we come to know what we know. Would that be a fair definition?
Yeah, generally, it's defined as the study of knowledge. So study of what we know, how we know it, you know, when we're justified. So
yes, and where I'm going with this, Caleb, is that you defined faith as when somebody places trust in a particular proposition, despite not having what you might call evidential warrant. And you said...
I'd say empirical. So I just want to clarify empirical evidence. So I think somebody can have warrant that you might call evidential, but it may not be empirical evidence.
Perfect. That's actually a really important correction. Yeah, no, you're absolutely spot on. Because testimony is a form of evidence. I would agree. And where I'm headed with this is that I just don't think it's particularly good evidence, depending on the claim. So you said that faith is when you have trust in a proposition despite not having empirical evidence, right? Have I gotten you right this time?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you said that you might trust that a proposition is true based on the testimony. So in the case of Thomas, it was the testimony of the other apostles, the other disciples, however you want to refer to them, right? Their testimony, in your view, perhaps as a Catholic, their testimony should have been enough.
Well, I would say it's a testimony in conjunction with, Thomas had spent time with Jesus and had seen him teach, perhaps had seen him perform miracles. We don't know their whole history together, but it would be a web of different things. I would say he had enough considerations to give him faith, although of course seeing Jesus is going to give him even more confirmation, but I think he had enough from those other things.
Okay, so you've added another element which is actually quite important. So if indeed he had seen Jesus perform other miracles and knew that he was quite literally a magical being who could perform miracles, like literally, break the laws of physics, walk on water, turn water into wine, whatever the case may be. Okay, fine. I'm just raising a broader epistemological concern, Caleb, about your epistemology, because what you seem to infer is that there are things in your life that you would believe based on testimony in the absence of empirical evidence. And I submit to you that, yeah, there are things. So, if I spoke with my mother today on the phone and she told me that she had toast for breakfast, I'm going to grant that. I'm going to believe that, because it's not a spectacular claim, is it? It's a fairly mundane thing. I know that toast is a thing. I know that people toast bread in the toaster. I know that it is a common food that is eaten for breakfast. And I've witnessed my mother in the past eat toast. I also know that my mother exists by virtue of being born and being raised by her. There's an embarrassment of evidence, and I just accept this based on her testimony, because it's not an extraordinary claim. But if I called my mother today and she told me that she had breakfast with Jesus, I wouldn't believe her. Now, I would believe that she was telling me the truth because I trust her as a person, because I don't think my mother would ever lie to me. She's the most honest person I know. And in fact, I think I get my honesty from her, which is why sometimes I come across, as I inferred earlier, as not even inferred, explicitly stated earlier, as quite short and blunt. But I think I get that from her. I know she'll watch this, so hi, ma'am. But in any case, I think I get that from her, my kind of like just very straightforward honesty. But I still wouldn't believe. I would believe she was telling me the truth, and yet I would think that she was under some kind of a misapprehension. In other words, her testimony, Caleb, wouldn't be enough for me to believe a claim that is so sensationalist. Now, that's my concern about your epistemology. It seems to me that you would be willing to believe something extraordinary on much lesser evidence than I would. Now, that doesn't necessarily make me more virtuous than you. Maybe I'm wrong here. Maybe you're about to tell me something that's going to completely change my view of evidence and epistemology and empiricism and all the rest of it. But how do you respond to that? Do you think that's a decent criticism of your position, or have I just gotten that completely upside down, backwards, inside out, and wrong ultimately?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in that case, I agree with you. I wouldn't, if somebody told me they, literally saw Jesus earlier, I might believe them. I might, but I would definitely wonder if there was some natural explanation, or, possibly even a supernatural explanation that's, inauthentic or whatever. I wouldn't just take it at face value. So, I guess I wonder certainly there are some doctrines that I hold to, largely simply because the Catholic Church teaches them, if it's something about theology, but that's because I'm already trusting, the Catholic Church, and I'm giving it the benefit of the doubt. But for my fundamental beliefs, I wouldn't form those based on testimony, because I agree that it's not necessarily reliable, or at least so. Like with Thomas, I think since he had walked with Jesus and spent time with him, and perhaps seen Jesus perform kinds of miracles, and his close people that he knew and trusted, and they're telling him, they saw Jesus risen. Like he could have been in a position to have enough, weight given his own experiences and such. But like for me, it wouldn't just be like, wow, the Catholic Church or whoever tells me Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. Okay, well, I'm going to believe it. They told me that. Like that certainly wouldn't be enough. Like for me, it's got to be something more from my own convictions. Now, that's not to say that my reasoning would necessarily convince you or somebody else who isn't already convinced. But yeah, it wouldn't be, my core beliefs wouldn't be because of testimony. It would be more like, well, I'm going to go with the Catholic Church on this, but that's because I've already accepted the Catholic Church, and I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt and weighing in on these matters. But yeah, I agree, testimony's not strong enough, especially if it's like a supernatural claim and something that's beyond anything I've experienced. It's just going to be, yeah, I'm going to question it.
Sure. And you said there, at risk of completely derailing the conversation, but you said there a number of times that you trust the Catholic Church. And for me, that rings alarm bells. I mean, the Catholic Church, I'd love to get your reaction to some of this stuff. Now, this doesn't get to the existence of God, but look, like we said, we didn't set an agenda, so this will be a little bit of a tangent. But I mean, correct me if I'm mistaken here, but doesn't the Catholic Church still preach the sinfulness of condom use and contraception use in Africa, which is a continent ravaged by AIDS, and a continent that is, has a very high birth rate and very high poverty, which is never a good combination? Isn't it also the institution that knowingly absconded justice for pedophile priests? Now, I'm not going to go down, they're all pedophiles. I would never make that claim. That's a silly claim. But there's been and obviously just way too many cases. One case is too many, but let's face it, the Catholic Church is leading the charge in terms of the pedophile championships, right? I mean, the amount of pedophile priests that have been discovered. And I mean, even if you want to dispute the claim about how prevalent it is in the church, fine. Even if it were only one case, it is a matter of record that the church has absconded justice and actively moved and relocated pedophile priests so that they could continue their crimes and torture more children. This is the institution that you're saying you trust. I mean, I'm running out of words here because I'm truth be told, struggling to remain calm while talking about the Catholic Church, which is a country that has done untold damage in my own nation of birth and to some of my very own loved ones. And this is not, by the way, to derail your response. You give me your response as exactly how you basically what I'm saying is respond exactly how you would normally respond. And please don't tiptoe around this topic because I've said that I have a personal connection to it. But I just find the institution to be somewhat reprehensible, to leave aside all of its supernatural bombastic claims about gods and, resurrections and all that stuff, but its ethical claims and its activity in Africa and the pedophile fiasco. I mean, how do you respond to all of that stuff when you make a claim that you trust them, a claim that you've made multiple times, Caleb?
Yeah, so to clarify what I mean by trust, so when it come down to, I'm going to trust their theology, so it's not necessarily to say I trust the individuals. Obviously, there's a lot of corrupt individuals within the church, and that's not, and I mean, I've had my own experiences with people in the church that I don't like, and have done things that I, that have wronged me and such, so that's, yeah. But yeah, but in terms of the theology, it does raise a concern, like we really trust that. And so to try to address both of the claims, so with the child abuse and such, yeah, I mean, the way the church has responded to that was, not good at all. It was horrible what's happened and such. And I mean, the percentage of priests that have been, convicted is fairly small, but as you said, like not one is too many. But yeah, there's been a number of cases. I don't dispute that, and yeah, the way they've dealt with that. But I wouldn't look at that as like as a theological doctrine. It's the choices that people within the church have made and so on. But with the condom use, so I do agree with the church's stance on contraception. However, that the Pope Benedict was a little bit unclear about the issue, and I think Pope Francis has been on as well when it comes to like preventing a disease and condoms. So I'm just gonna refrain from commenting on that particular application because I have mixed feelings on it. But in general, I do agree with what the church teaches about contraception, and I recognize that's very controversial. But I just want to flag that. So I would say. But yeah, I trust that the Holy Spirit is guiding the church over time, that when they're going to release a document, or the Pope is going to release a statement for the church, that the Holy Spirit is guiding that document kind of the way that other Christians will also believe that the Holy Spirit guided the Bible. Now, with that being said, like the Bible has claims that I think taken at face value, like, you can find something in the Old Testament and say like, oh, well, do you agree with that exactly? I'd say no. But I think within the body of the Bible, it does give us a understanding of God and, of how to live to be a charitable person and stuff. So you got to read it as a whole. And I'm going to look at it in light of the person of Christ and such. And that's kind of how I look at the church's teachings as well. It's like things can be updated, but I'm still going to trust that core teaching is guided by the Holy Spirit. And I recognize that it's going to be hard to defend that claim for some, especially. So that's going to be something that's going to be more like, well, yeah, I recognize I'm going to have a harder time making an argument for that, but it's kind of like, I feel confident in more fundamental beliefs about Christianity that lead me to Catholicism, that it's like I'm going to put my weight behind, like, well, this is something I'm going to put my weight behind, but I recognize maybe I wouldn't be able to debate this point as much as like I'm getting into like a argument about God or nature of the mind, like we talked about, where I'm going to be more like confident, like I've got like a good argument here. It's more like, well, this is like personal choice that I make, and because I believe in Christ and the sacraments and stuff. So hopefully that makes sense. There was a lot there, but I kind of make a distinction between like there are topics where I'm like, yeah, I'd be willing to debate this. Another topic like, well, how do you know the Catholic Church is right on this specific doctrine or something? It's like, well, I put my weight behind it. I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt, but maybe I'm not as confident. Like I could give you like a knockdown argument for it on that like specific. So hopefully that makes sense.
At risk of making you uncomfortable, and you don't have to answer any question that I ask you, obviously, you are your own autonomous individual, and if you don't want to answer the following question, please don't. You seem to infer that you may not want to answer the following question, but I wouldn't be the magic skeptic if I didn't drill down on this particular point. But you said that you agree with the Catholic Church's view on contraception and that you trust that the Holy Spirit is guiding the whole show. So, I mean, I'm at pains. I have to ask you the follow-up question, which is, are you really telling me that you agree with telling the people of Africa? Are you saying that you don't make an exception even in that case, in a continent where AIDS is a significant problem, and in a continent that has a very, very high birth rate combined with poverty? Are you saying that it is moral teaching to continue to tell those people that condom usage and contraception usage is going to is tantamount to committing a sin and is a negative thing to do? Are you saying you agree with that teaching, even in the case of Africa?
So that's what I was saying on that specific topic of applying it in the case of preventing a disease. I'm going to refrain from commenting, but the general view, like say all things being equal, somebody's in so we're not talking about preventing a disease. We're just talking about a married relation.
Sure.
The church says they shouldn't use contraception because it's a barrier to the sexual act and such. I agree with the church's teaching on that. I recognize that's controversial as well. Now, if we're talking about condom use to prevent, AIDS or Zika virus and so on, I'm just gonna refrain from commenting because I might have sort of feel I sympathize with the idea, but the church. So the church has been a little iffy because there have been different statements, and since I am somewhat representing Catholics, I'm going to just refrain from taking a stance on it. But like
See, I think it's a really easy question.
Difficult. Yeah, well, it's difficult because obviously, if a couple, has a deadly disease and they're going to have sex, I think it is. They should use a condom to prevent that disease. But I would say ideally they should refrain from having sex. But I know that's controversial. But yeah, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. And that's where I'm. Yeah, and it's not. And I don't go over this topic a lot, so I'm kind of thinking how I want to phrase it.
Sure. No, well, look, you've made a key admission, which is I'm very happy to hear you make, which is if a couple had a deadly virus and they're going to have sex, that they should use a condom, but that you would prefer that they just didn't have sex at all. Now, obviously, I don't think that's realistic. You even inferred that's a controversial point of view. Fine, but I get it. You're a Catholic. You're going to have that view. I'm not surprised that you have that view, but I'm happy to hear you say that you might make an exception in the case of a deadly disease, although the extent to which HIV is deadly anymore is not clear to me because apparently the antiviral medications now are very strong. That said, it's still not good to be passing that virus around, is it? So you seem to tacitly suggest that you might be okay with condom usage in those exceptional circumstances.
Right. And there can be a situation where somebody's going to definitely do something that one disagrees with, but they could take the lesser of. You would still, I think the church would say, still the person should take the lesser of evils, even if they just. So hopefully that made sense to the audience, and to yourself. I think you got my position on it. So.
I've got your position for sure, and I obviously have a lot of problems with it, and I would just say, and you can feel free to respond to any of these. I'm never going to make a comment and then blow by it and try and move on without giving you a chance to respond. But I would just say this in terms of my closing comment, which again, feel free to respond to this. This is one of the reasons that I'm an atheist. You seem like a very nice person, and I don't know you very well, but seeing the way you interact with people on Twitter, the way you've interacted with me, you seem to be honest. You seem to be really and truly trying to search the truth. But, and here's the but, and I don't know if there's a way of phrasing this that isn't going to come across as insensitive. It took 5, maybe 8 minutes. I don't know. Somebody can check the clock. Maybe it wasn't even 5 minutes. However long it was, it took, in my opinion, far too long in that over and back between you and I to get you to agree to what is, in my view, a very obvious, just remarkably obvious, straightforward policy prescription for a continent that has an AIDS and birth rate problem. The prescription being contraception is a good idea. It took you quite a while to get to the point where you said, and even now it's not like an enthusiastic, no, they should definitely use condoms in cases like that. You're still kind of adding the caveat of, maybe they just shouldn't have sex though. It seems like what's happening, in my view, and forgive me for psychologizing you for a moment, I'm not a psychologist, so all this should be taken with a pinch of salt. But it seems to me like what's happening in this conversation is that you, a very honest, upstanding individual who clearly has integrity and is searching for the truth, is you're not discovering, because clearly you knew this all along, but what's happening is you're struggling to reconcile the tenets of your faith with your moral compass, which is, it seems to me, almost screaming out and saying, no, clearly condoms are a good idea here, but I'm, copper fastened to this text and to the catechism of the church, and so I'm kind of here. By your own admission, you're here as a stand-in for the Catholic Church's position, and you're trying your best to defend it, even though, and here's my view, some of it might actually be indefensible. Now, look, that's the last thing I'm going to say on it, Caleb, but I do, in the interest of fairness, want to give you a chance to respond to that, because I've said a lot there, including psychologizing you, and it would be absolutely despicable if I didn't give you a chance to follow up there, and then we can move past this particular point to the arguments for God's existence, if you'd be interested. But feel free to follow up, my friend, because I've said a lot there.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to recall everything. So, with some issues, I mean, there is going to be some difficulties even amongst Christians, and certainly amongst, Christians and atheists and so on. Now I do want to flag, you said this is why you're an atheist. Now I do want to flag, you could believe in God and totally reject Christianity and Catholicism. But I just want to flag that.
That's fair, yeah.
Yep. But in terms of this issue, so I guess kind of a parallel example is, so a lot of atheists will be pro-choice, and a lot of Christians will immediately balk at that and be like, "Oh, that," and you, or maybe you wouldn't, but some will maybe take a while to explain their pro-choice position, and a lot of Catholics, especially, are going to be screaming out like, "It's obviously immoral," and I would say, like, yeah, I mean, sometimes things are difficult given other background beliefs that you have. So I recognize if I wasn't Catholic, I might immediately say, yeah, like, condoms aren't even wrong. Like, of course they should, especially in a situation like that. But given that I feel like I have reasons to be Catholic, and I recognize, like, this is kind of like one of those issues that's very difficult, I'm going to be like, wow, how can I navigate around this issue? I could be a faithful Catholic, but also recognize, the difficulties. So, like, for me, abortion's obviously immoral in my mind, but I recognize if somebody was, like, still trying to figure out their thoughts on it, I wouldn't be like, wow, that shows the bankruptcy of their position. I'd be like, well, maybe that's something that they kind of struggle to navigate around. So I just put that out there as a kind of comparison, but I recognize where you're coming from, and it's a difficult topic for sure.
Sure, and look, on that, we spent a bit of time talking about the Catholic Church and morals and ethics and so on. I think the listeners have heard from both of us. I think they've heard enough to make up their own mind about which side of the argument they find the most persuasive, or maybe they'll think that both of us have the wrong answer and there's a third option that we're both blissfully ignorant to, and that would be totally fine too. And that concludes part 1 of my debate with Dry Apologist. And now it's over to you. What did you think? Who had the better argument? Were there any strengths or weaknesses in his position or mine? Would you care to offer any constructive criticism? Whatever your thoughts are, jump into the comments below and let me know. One of the best things about my channel is that the conversation often continues for days and sometimes weeks after the initial upload, and I can't wait to interact with you guys in those comments. So jump right into those comments and let me know what you're thinking. Other than that, guys, thank you very much for getting this far in the video. If you liked it, drop a like, and if it's your first time visiting the channel and you're still watching, hit the subscribe button, and while you're at it, don't forget to check the bell notification icon. That way you'll be able to stay up to date with all things on the channel, and you'll even be notified as and when my latest videos go live. One other thing to make you aware of is that, again, remember, this is only part 1 of my debate with Dry Apologist. So if you enjoyed this part, make sure you check out part 2, which will follow up next week. Or if indeed you're watching this in the future, you can watch part 2 right away. In closing then, guys, I want to extend a special thank you to all of my supporters and an extra special thank you to my patrons. You guys are amazing. I love you. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to become a patron like those I've just mentioned, you can find the link in the description box below. Hit that link and you can sign up for as little as £3 per month, and you'll gain access to a plethora of perks and awesome extras. All that said and out of the way, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in part 2 next week. All the best. Bye-bye.